So back when I was in high school, my freshman year English teacher was a little bit cruel to us students and had us read as our first book of the year, Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. And despite the lofty title, I had very low expectations about the book. Nonetheless, we all plowed through this incredibly long and dense novel set in Dickens' usual bleak, depressing, post-industrial England. It follows the life of a young orphan named Pip, who suffers in abject poverty. All this starts to change when an old spinster, Mrs. Havisham, who wants to take revenge on the entire male gender because she was stood up at the altar by her fiancé, asks Pip to come socialize with her adopted daughter, Estella. Now, of course, Pip promptly falls in love with Estella because she's quite beautiful, and Mrs. Havisham had cruelly encouraged this as part of her hateful scheme because she had made Estella incapable of loving by poisoning her heart. Now, through this whole novel, through Pip's rise to fortune and his eventual fall back down into poverty, the one thing that we really want to know as readers is whether Pip is ever going to win the girl, whether Stella's heart of ice will ever melt. Now, of course, Dickens concluded this novel with an ending befitting his usual bleak disposition. Estella's heart never opens. She never loves Pip, and he never achieves happiness in his life. Now, this was an incredibly depressing ending, and it absolutely outraged Dickens' editor. After such a long and emotionally fraught story, his choice to be true to the characters was just too cruel to the readers. It was essentially the 19th century version of Voldemort winning. So ultimately, in the end, Dickens was forced to change the ending to his novel, allowing the boy to get the girl. The true ending became little more than a footnote in the revised edition. Now, when I got to the end of this book, it seemed so strange to me that there were actually two endings to the book. And it was so unsatisfying to be left with that kind of ambiguity. But this taught me something very important. The need for a redemptive ending to the stories that we tell is a very common feature in our culture. Consider this. In Pretty Woman, Julia Roberts and Richard Gere end up together at the end of the movie, even though the original play that Pretty Woman is based off of had a very different ending. In the play, Vivian sinks into a drug addiction and is dumped back onto the streets of Hollywood Boulevard by Edward. The two never see each other again. Of course, what Hollywood executive is going to produce a tragic cautionary tale about drugs and the world's oldest profession over a romantic comedy? Even the Holocaust movies produced in America almost universally have redemptive endings. Most notably, Steven Spielberg's magnum opus, Schindler's List, concludes by showing us the families and the survivors visiting Oskar Schindler's grave, leaving us with a message of hope that these people survived that completely overshadows the cataclysmic destruction of European Jewry. All of this points to one fact about our culture. We don't deal very well with tragedy. We can't cope with unresolved stories, and we are very bad at bearing witness to meaningless pain. We need Pip to end up with Estella. We can't face the horrors of the Holocaust without finding a silver lining. But this isn't just true about literature or Hollywood or history. This is also true about our personal relationships. Many who have gone through a significant loss in their life will tell you that their friends and family are not particularly good at dealing with their grieving. C.S. Lewis, the Christian theologian who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, wrote about this phenomenon in his book, A Grief Observed. In this work, Lewis recorded his journey through the grieving process for his wife, who died very young from cancer. The loss absolutely devastated C.S. Lewis. His whole theology had to change, and the entire process nearly unmade him. C.S. Lewis wrote that for the first month or so after his wife died, his friends and supporters were really quite helpful at dealing with his pain. But after that, their support waned significantly. They would tell him to buck up and move on with his life. And to be sure, these sentiments came from a place of wanting to help, of wanting to fix the situation. But for C.S. Lewis, this wasn't a situation that could be fixed. These sentiments just signaled to him that his friends were no longer willing to carry his pain with them. They had decided that it was time for him to move on with his life, regardless of where he was emotionally. And other friends avoided him entirely because they just didn't want to be around his pain anymore. They stopped coming over, and they stopped calling. In the end, C.S. Lewis was all alone with his grief. The harsh reality is that other people's pain makes us uncomfortable. It's threatening to our sense of security. Now, admittedly, being around pain is incredibly scary. But I believe that when we have such a strong aversion to being around pain, including our own, we create deep alienation between us and our loved ones, and even within our own souls. Pain demands to be expressed, because pain that is bottled up can be incredibly destructive. The cultural critic Elaine Scarry, in her book, The Body in Pain, asserts that pain unmakes the universe. What does she mean by that? Pain unmakes the universe because a person experiencing the worst kind of pain can't think about anything other than that pain. This person's world of relationships is completely destroyed because her soul sinks into a black hole that she doesn't know how to communicate out of. Intolerable pain is all-consuming. It eliminates thoughts and feelings, and in extreme cases, a person in pain loses her sense of self. And when a person is not able to ground herself in her identity, her universe truly does dissolve into chaos. Now, not only does pain demand to be expressed, but it is also something that we are commanded to deal with in this season, as it is an important part of our liturgical calendar. Last week, the Jewish people observed Tzom Tammuz, the fast day that commemorates the day that the Babylonians breached the wall of Jerusalem. 2 days from now is Rosh Chodesh Av, and with the coming of the month of Av, our hearts grow heavy with sadness. And all of this leads up to a week and a half from now, when our people will observe Tisha B'Av, our day of mourning, the fast day that commemorates the final destruction of the Jerusalem temple to the Babylonians. We are in the midst of a season of lament, the time when we recall all the tragedies that have ever befallen our people, the time when we remember when our people saw no meaning and no redemption in their oppression. In commemoration of our mourning, we read the book of Lamentations, the words that Jeremiah supposedly wrote as the Jewish people were being forced to leave their homeland and go into exile. Now, despite this trauma that our people have suffered, many of us in the liberal movements don't really do that much to observe Tisha B'Av. After all, what significance do the ancient temples in Jerusalem actually hold for us? We don't want our religious practice to go back to animal sacrifice and holy barbecue. We connect to God through prayer and acts of loving kindness. So, ultimately, mourning for the temple and longing to go back to Judaism's ancient roots seems disingenuous. However, I suspect that our disinclination to observe Tisha B'Av has less to do with theology and more to do with our discomfort as a culture with dealing with pain. Just as we can't cope with Pip not ending up with Estella, so do we not want our Judaism to become a mournful religion. Reformed Jews have mostly eliminated lament from the liturgy because we don't want to acknowledge that brokenness and darkness exist inside of our souls. It's scary to go to a place where we feel abandoned and unloved by God. However, I believe that downplaying Tisha B'Av and the process of lament does us a tremendous disservice as Jews and as human beings. Many people find that having a day to mourn the long parade of violences that have been visited upon the Jews is incredibly meaningful. Our communal day of mourning will take on added significance this year as we lament for our beloved homeland engulfed in violent armed conflict against terrorism. Others find tremendous meaning in reading our sacred texts of lament and find the experience both moving and deeply personal. In the book Chapters of the Heart, Rabbi Dr. Rachel Adler illustrates how reading the book of Lamentations actually helped her find meaning in the midst of a horrible tragedy in her life. Dr. Adler's mother suffered through dementia for almost a decade before her death. A woman of tremendous intellect and education, she lost all of her memory, and in the last several years of her life, all capacity to use language. Dr. Adler, in caring for her mother, had to cope with the devastating knowledge that while she was giving her mother care, her mother did not know who she was. She writes, My mother can no longer speak, but something is terribly wrong. My mother is rocking back and forth. She claps her hands. She cries out in agony. She does not respond to requests to show us where it hurts. It occurs to me that there might be no physical locus for her pain, that she is simply lamenting her devastated life. The words of the biblical book of Lamentations rise in my mind. "O mother, how can I express your devastation? Your ruin is as vast as the sea. Who could possibly heal you?" It is the first time that words to God have fit the horror that I am witnessing. The analogy is very powerful for me. My mother is a ruined city. The lights are blinking out. The streets are empty. Lonely sits the city once great with people. Like despoiled Jerusalem, my mother is all alone. It is hard and painful to read these words of lament, but I believe that lamenting is actually the first and perhaps most important step in the process of encountering pain, dealing with it, and ultimately transcending it. How is that the case? Dr. Adler has actually written extensively about this. First of all, she points out that the book of Lamentations is structured as an acrostic in 4 of its 5 chapters, with every letter of the Hebrew alphabet beginning the first word of one verse. Now, by giving every letter a line, Lamentations is symbolically encapsulating the entirety of language, from A to Z and Aleph to Taf. After all, language is the way that God creates the universe in the book of Genesis. God spoke and the world came into being. Similarly, the book of Lamentations begins with a gasp of agony, Echa, alas. This cry is not language at all, but a primordial, chaotic expression of pure agony. But out of that chaos, out of that emotion, Lamentations moves into language, into creation, into the process of rebuilding. When pain and loss destroys our universe, it is through the language of lament that we can begin the process of rebuilding our universe. By putting language around our pain, we can begin to master it and take control back from it. Because when we articulate what the all-consuming black hole feels like, we can begin to overcome the loneliness of our pain. It is for this reason that Elaine Scarry writes that witnessing someone in pain regain their capacity for speech is like witnessing a rebirth. Secondly, lament helps a person in pain because lament does not follow a linear, coherent path. Lament meanders through an array of emotions, many of which are contradictory. For instance, the book of Lamentations alternates between a cry at the devastation of the city of Jerusalem, an agonized declaration that it was our fault that this happened to us, and an outraged accusation that God would do such a terrible thing to us. Similarly, when someone experiences the loss of a loved one, that person rarely goes through the well-known 5-step process of grief that leads them to getting over it at the end. They often meander through contradictory feelings of guilt, disbelief, sadness, anger, and loneliness, only to revisit those feelings all over again. People who go through loss will often repeat the exact same story 50 times because they are stuck in an ever-repeating cycle of emotions that they don't know how to break out of. So we can see that lament helps a person in pain make sense of it because it is the only literary genre that through its nonlinearity and its repetitions actually expresses what's going on inside of the soul of someone who is suffering. Lament is also helpful to us because it enables us to express feelings that we have that are not necessarily decent to say in polite conversation. The book of Lamentations does not always afford God the reverence that we would normally display. In fact, it says some rather shocking things. For instance, it accuses God of acting like a lion, lurking and waiting to pounce and devour us. In the book of Job, the lamenter even expresses the desire that he had never been born. Now, if we're not suffering, we may not believe in a God so cruel and unloving. But it is still important to acknowledge that a person experiencing pain might be dealing with the reality of feeling stalked and devoured. Allowing the lamenter to say these indecent things empowers him to feel the justified anger that he has towards God. Our society often tells us that anger is something that we have to repress inside of ourselves. but oftentimes allowing for catharsis can be profoundly healing. So we see that paradoxically, in allowing ourselves to express the agony of our suffering, we can begin to find the ray of light at the end of the tunnel. It is the process of lamenting itself that is the key to returning ourselves to life and to hope. When people express their pain, they often just feel gratitude that someone would take the time to listen to them. Some people even find that through the process of lament, that their emotional intelligence increases and they're able to connect to others through empathy. Either way, something really important happens inside of ourselves when we go through the process of lament, because expressing our pain is the first step to understanding it and the first step to transcending it. Now, for some of us, the best way of dealing with loss is to find our strength and resilience and try to move on with our lives as best as we can. There's certainly merit to that position because it's not always helpful to go to pieces or to get stuck in the process of lament. But sometimes we really have to allow ourselves to express the reality of what we're experiencing inside of our hearts. So I'm going to be honest with you guys. This Tisha B'Av, I'm not going to be mourning the ancient temples in Jerusalem. But there are metaphorical temples inside of my heart, and I suspect inside of all of your hearts, that do need to be lamented. Temples that were destroyed by the heartbreak of a lover or the betrayal of a friend. Temples that were destroyed by the loss of a loved one. Temples that were destroyed when we lost our job or failed to find work. Temples that were destroyed when bombs fell on our beloved Israel and Israeli soldiers died protecting the Jewish state as well as innocent Palestinians. Temples that were destroyed by depression and other mental illnesses. Temples that were destroyed when we experienced brokenness of the body through illness or injury. And temples that were destroyed by despair. None of us have gotten to this point unscathed. So I believe it's important for us to be emotionally honest with ourselves. Acknowledge that things don't always turn out the way we want. And sometimes in the stories of our lives, the depressing Dickens ending, and not the idealized Hollywood ending, is the one that rings truer for us in the moment. But even when we experience that pain and our universe falls to pieces, there is always hope that through expressing our feelings, reaching out to each other, and yes, sometimes even calling out to God, that we can find the resilience inside of our souls to rebuild our universe. And just maybe, when we rebuild our universe, just a little bit of our brokenness will be transformed into wholeness. Shabbat Shalom.